So the topic for the evening, I decided to just go back. We are going to talk about ethics. And just before I start, how many people here regularly, like once or twice a month, come to this Monday Sangha? Wow, awesome, great. How many people it's their first time here on a Monday? Welcome, everybody. Great. So for many of you who come often, you've probably heard this idea of ethics, especially from the Buddhist perspective. But when we think about ethics, the way we learn it in school, or maybe the way we hear about it, we think it is something that is done in high councils. And there's a lot of decision makers, and it's kind of imposed morals. Is that what people think of when they generally think of ethics? Yes, no? Not from the Buddhist point of view, from the more kind of Western approach. What do people think of? Just one or two examples.
Doing the right thing.
Doing the right thing. Anyone else?
Doing no harm.
Yeah. When I think of ethics? Business, right. Medicine, bioethics, or, yeah, how do we, not cheating, right. These are all great things, right? We do want to keep businesses in check. We do want to have us not harm others. But when we think about the Buddhist approach to ethics, it's very much more at an individual level of what are these underlying motivations and principles that keep me going on a daily basis. Now, indeed, if you look at the kind of list of precepts from the Buddhist tradition, there's like over 200, and they might feel like a list of what not to do. And in fact, they're often considered a way to help us avoid things that get in the way of our basic goodness. So not harming others, not using intoxicants to a level that makes us have unwise choices. These are some of the ethics you may have heard before. One of the favorites of a teacher here, Megan Cowan, who some of you may have sat with, is the ethic of wise speech, not having a kind of idle gossip or allowing ourselves to engage in conversation that's harmful. Such an insidious one. I mean, I think about that one a lot because the minute I leave the house, there's already some judgment happening about the way that person is driving in front of me and totally going to try and run me over on my bike, about someone who's in line in front of me and they're taking way too long to order coffee, right? So this way that even in our everyday activities, there's actually an opportunity to consider and reflect on some sort of ethical basis. Now, why ethics as like a personal endeavor might be worthwhile, and again, not something too moralistic, but something more engaging, is a lot of the reason I believe why you guys are here tonight. It's your core motivation. So when I asked you before, during the meditation, to think of your highest aspiration for being here, would anybody mind sharing what that is? Why they come here? Why they spend their time doing this?
To help me be a vessel for service and to help reduce suffering in the world.
Great. Helping others, being kind of capable and able to do that. Anyone else? What was their high aspiration for being here tonight? Yeah. Wow, yeah, to know the truth and be able to live it. Other?
Community.
Community? Yeah, building connections. Anybody else? Aspiration for being here?
To reduce anxiety and inner turmoil.
Yeah, reduce anxiety and inner turmoil. Yeah.
Cultivate a sense of kindness.
Yeah. How about one or two more people?
To learn how to take care of myself.
Yeah. Learn how to take care of yourself? Yeah.
I want to integrate and accept everything.
Wow. These are awesome aspirations. Yeah, please.
Integrating this with my 12-step program.
Integrating this with cross-step program. 12-step program.
Yes.
I said cross-step. I thought I was missing out on some new fitness. Not cross-step. 12-step. Awesome. Yeah, and I think, I think our ethics, all revolve around these personal endeavors, but with really kind of awesomely large ideals, right? And I know for myself that I had never really considered the ethics of why I practiced until things got really hard, and until I kind of had to really look at why I was practicing and what it could mean for me in my life. It was interesting. I remember for the first time asking a Buddhist friend. I was in Mexico and I was teaching a 2-week workshop there. And driving from Mexico City to the mountains, I asked these Buddhists I was in the car with, I said, what does this refuge, taking refuge mean? Does that mean giving up everything that's fun and enjoyable? I had a feeling ethics were involved. And to me, it sounded like I was going to have to give up a lot. And it was amazing. The answer I got was, taking refuge means creating your mind as a place of peace. And that really stuck with me. And that stuck with me as a set of ethics that I could get behind. Right? Like, wow, if my main motivation is to create my mind as a place of peace, I can really think about that. I can use that actually as a compass. And while I was on that Mexico City retreat, I actually had a herniated disc. I didn't know it yet, but it just started to really give me a lot of pain. And I was at the end of a relationship that had been going on for a long time. I had a dad who was very sick in the hospital and a brother who was relapsing. So it was there for me. Like all of my places where I found stability, all of my escapes, especially through my body. I love being in the ocean and surfing and running around. It was all just, it may have never been there. It was so far away. And then I came back to this idea again, wow, can my mind actually be the place of refuge? Can that be a place where I can manage and deal with all of this? And of course, because I'm sitting here today, the answer is yes, and it was by no means a kind of moment of insight and everything was great. But it did mean that as I was going through those really difficult times, I felt like there was this thing that was the underlying motivation for why I kept trying to keep my mood up, why I didn't just devolve into kind of self-pity or bitterness or blaming someone, which I think at the moment would have felt pretty empowering. And yet I had this idea, like, is there a way in which this is going to disrupt that peace of mind that I'm looking for? And so I think when we consider these individual ethics, we are considering, like, what are these things that underlie and motivate me? What do I believe will actually bring me closer to that? If my ethics are to have less anxiety, if my ethics are to take better care of myself, what are the kind of everyday steps that I take to get there? And they can be really small, right? Really small. And I think, in fact, that coming to this place and dedicating your time to be here, it means you're already committed, right? So if ethics, in a very kind of blunt way, are what you avoid, what you avoid, and then what you commit to, right? It's one way to think about it. So we're avoiding these lists of things that might get in the way, but what are we committing to? What really matters to us? And I think that's pretty much the most kind of important piece and foundation of our practice. Even if we sit through a practice like this woman was suggesting here, very bravely admitting, my mind is a mess, it's all over the place. But if our underlying motivation when we go to sit is still one, I am doing this with this intention, with this motivation behind my practice. Whatever we're doing is helping us along the way. And not in some abstract way, like, oh, I'm developing this merit and at some point I'll cash in on it. But like, really, it actually helps, right? It does soften your mind. It does ease your everyday. And the other part of Buddhist ethics that I think some people might struggle with, or it's like, okay, I get this thing about taking care of myself. That seems totally reasonable. Why am I then committing myself to take care of everybody else? And not just like the people I like, but all sentient beings. Am I really signing up for that? Because I am not going to succeed, right? My ethics are, create myself as a vessel so that I can then be of service to everyone. Like that just sounds like a little bit of an impossible task. So why is that? What you hear, like pretty much the minute you walk into almost any Buddhist center, or you open up a Buddhist book, is we're committing ourselves to the freedom, the liberation, the reduction of suffering to all beings. Anybody have any ideas why? Why that's a good practice? Yeah.
I mean, because you can't really draw the line reasonably anywhere else, you know? Like, every other line you draw is going to be, like, arbitrary. Like, only my friends will, like...
Who's your friend?
What? Yeah, exactly. Or what about acquaintances, where they fall, you know?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
It's a rational response. Yeah, yeah.
Just, we're kind of like all one anyway, you know, this whole organism of humanity, and so if we're helping everybody, we're kind of helping us too.
Yeah, and I think that's a real, like a beautiful way to think about it, and definitely kind of that butterfly effect approach, that this little thing we do here, it's not what we're directly trying to benefit ourselves, but in the end, we're so connected that it all matters. Yeah. Anybody else, when they hear that precept, does it make them think of what's their motivation, or why do they think, yeah, I guess I'll undertake this and continue on this path?
Reinforce the feeling of feeling connected, like that we are all connected.
Yeah, so to reinforce that connection. And, you know, I know for myself and a friend of mine in the room over here, there's a lot of us who dedicate our lives to helping others. And it's a calling, it's a profession. And part of that is indeed, you know, you want to kind of imagine and live in the world you wish to create. Like, I believe that helping other people, that's what I believe in. Those are my values. And, you know, with that, there's also this pretty quick recognition that helping other people feels good. And I think we hesitate to admit that, like it somehow, you know, tarnishes that goodness if we say that it makes us feel good. Let's be honest, it feels really good, right? It's great. And actually, it feels good for a biologically kind of imperative reason. We're literally hardwired head to toe to respond to one another's emotionally, to the cues that we pick up, whether it's suffering or joy. So if we encounter and we witness the struggle of other people, it makes us suffer, right? Through our mirror neuron system, through our kind of just empathic ability and emotional resonance, to then help and tune in. Not only is it a relief, there's actually kind of a dopamine reward of helping other people. So I'm not trying to reduce us to the biological science of why we should help others, but I think sometimes it's good to remember it's totally natural, this wanting to help others, right? Now, you can go about helping others in a way that you think is, you know, I'm on my mission and maybe living my ethics, but I spent a number of years working here at SF General in the emergency room, and loved that work and felt like I got a lot of reward. But I didn't really have a clear kind of guiding principle other than help others. And I definitely didn't have a principle of help myself or help myself first. And I got pretty drained. And I think in a lot of ways it prevented me from being available to friends and to family members. And I just was so caught up in this work and in this endeavor. So again, without ethics, even something that is in action and instrumentally worthwhile and by all accounts good can still be something that actually doesn't sustain us, that doesn't feed us. And I think it's worthwhile to reflect on, you know, underneath those things we think are good, are we still actually, you know, in touch with and caring and tending to that core motivation or intention? And now the other aspect that we heard alluded to over here of, well, you know, since we're all connected, why don't we reinforce this? And you think about one of the kind of principal ideas of Buddhism is by practicing this, we are actually able in some ways to reduce our suffering, right? And that's part of the Four Noble Truths, that we recognize there's suffering, we see there's causes to that suffering, we also see that there's a path away from it, and there's ways to be indeed free. Now, one of the core ways that we suffer in our everyday life, outside of just the kind of degradation of, you know, illness, people we love being hurt, losing things we care about, like those are the things those are the suffering that we don't have much control over, right? But the other suffering, which arguably actually occupies more of our everyday life, is our mental suffering. And we think about that mental suffering and what it's predicated on. And it's predicated on this delusion that we are separate, this feeling that somehow we are not connected to others. And so by really accepting and kind of integrating this idea of connection and caring for others, indeed, where do you draw the line, right? How could you practice anything except for kindness? It's kind of the only reasonable and rational solution. So I just wanted us to really not just hear what I'm saying, but think about that. So I'm going to invite us for just a moment to, again, as comfortably as you'd like to, but just to close your eyes. And I'm going to ask you to really think about and reflect on this idea of the benefits of kindness. So I want you to bring to mind some time in the last week or maybe the last month when you witnessed kindness between two people. They could have been strangers or colleagues, family members, or friends. But bring to mind with as much detail as you can, not only this act of kindness, it could have been quite simple or something profound. And really focus on what it felt like to witness that kindness. You may notice it'll even bring a smile to your lips, or some sort of lightness or elation in the chest. And now I want you to think of a time when you received kindness in the last week or the last month. When a friend, a colleague, family member, or even stranger just offered themselves, their time, or some resource that you needed. You had a need and it was met. And not through bartering, not through exchange, just kindness. And again, just focus on how it feels to remember that receiving of kindness. And then now shift, lastly, to a time in the last week or the last month when you gave kindness to someone else. Again, a friend or family member, stranger or colleague. Maybe you were moved by their struggle. Maybe you saw them in need in some way. And likely, without even a whole lot of forethought, you just acted. You were present. And again, just focus on how it felt to extend this kindness, how it felt to maybe know you were of service, you could help someone and support them in that moment. And just give yourself some time to savor that feeling. Then gently wiggling our fingers and toes and blinking our eyes back into the room. I want to share a quote with you by one of my heroes of kindness, the Dalai Lama. Might be a quote you've heard, but maybe in light of this talk gives you some new meaning. He says, "This is my simple religion. There's no need for temples, no need for complicated philosophy. Our own brain, our own heart is temple, and the philosophy is kindness." And I just want to really engage with you guys a little bit deeper on this topic. I could definitely keep talking and fill up the entire evening, but I learn more, and I think you learn more when we discuss these ideas. What I've talked about so far are ethics, what they mean in a grander sense, and what they mean to us individually, what motivates us on a daily basis, and why it makes sense that part of our ethics are about that underlying motivation, maybe for peace of mind, or for some sort of ease and equanimity, and why it also makes sense that part of our ethics include others and being of service. So I would love your questions and comments, please. Maybe even on an experience from that practice. Yeah.
Excuse me. I came from a family with a lot of kids. There were 5 of us, and I was the youngest. So everybody was there when I showed up, and that whole thing was going on. And then when I was 5, we lost our father, and that was like, he died, and that was like this horrendous experience in our family. And we lived in a small town where he had grown up, and his family was kind of prominent. And so it was this horrendous thing in this town, this guy that everybody knew and loved with a family and all these kids, and he died, and it was tragic. And I just had such a childhood filled with seeing people suffering, but at the same time seeing a lot of people being really kind to us because we were suffering, us kids and stuff. And I just remember being struck by that throughout my life. And coming up, I decided that was the most important thing in the world, was being of service to one another, being kind to one another, and helping each other out, because life was tough. And then I experienced other places where life was tough. And I experienced some places where life was really, really fucking tough.
Yeah.
And so, like you've already said, kindness is the only rational response to this life. It's hard, man. Yeah. And when I was first exposed to Buddhism and saw, as a very young man, and saw what the deal was with it, I was like, yeah, this works for me. Yeah. And it took me a while of being a real dilettante to finally decide, okay, this is the path that I'm on. I'm not checking this out anymore. I'm not, experimenting with this anymore, seeing if it works. I'm seeing it work, and I'm going to commit to this path. And it keeps on, but I always, as out there as this path could get, with a lot of different streams that the Dharma comes from, the basic idea of kindness and compassion, the Dalai Lama said it really well. There's no temple. You need no philosophy. The philosophy is kindness. Yeah. The temple is ourselves.
Yeah, and I think it's really great. Thank you for sharing that with us. And I think actually we can orient ourselves towards seeing more kindness in our everyday life. That there's a way in which, if we orient ourselves to seeing how much things have changed or how much things are not the way we'd like them, and there's so much greed these days, so much materialism, totally true. Still the kindness is there, really just at the corner. And interestingly, you really find it in these difficult times. When you're going through a crisis, it's just amazing who shows up with kindness, like your Lyft driver, right? Or just a random stranger. It's really humbling, and I think you don't have to wait for a crisis to see it, and yet somehow we're so much more susceptible and porous during those times. Yes, please.
One of the, heard Thich Nhat Hanh give a talk about compassion and he talked about the Rodney King beatings. And when he saw it, his thought was, oh, those cops that are beating him must really be suffering. And that story really changed my perspective on compassion. And my practice now is to try to do that often. And I've been trying to do it for the people that are killing the elephants. And it's been really challenging.
Yeah.
To see photos and do that practice for these people. And I don't know if there's a question there, but it's easy to be kind to a homeless person, right? But where there's so much hate involved, that's where I find it so much tougher.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I like that example. Thich Nhat Hanh has a wonderful poem called I Am the Pirate, that I don't know if you've ever seen it, but you might enjoy it. And he describes that our compassion can't have any bounds. It can't have a boundary between the pirate who's abusing children and the child who's abused. That's the essence of the poem. And, I think it's a really high level practice, right? I would start a little closer to home. Do you know what I mean? Because I'm so into going big, but I really think it's easier to, step by step, and maybe for one day a week, go for those people who are just so deluded that they don't know the harm they do. But we can start a little earlier and have compassion for those people who just kind of annoy us. They're actually hard targets, to be honest, right? It's very hard to imagine that in some ways they just want what we want, they want to be happy, they want to be free from suffering. But it's a really nice way to exercise that ethics muscle on a daily way. So, thank you. There's 2 questions here. Yeah.
The ethics of self-care, and especially considering your work with people that are burnt out, general things like that.
Yeah.
Perspective on that.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. If anyone didn't hear, it's the ethics of self-care. And one of the first practices I do for folks who I work with is actually trying to identify what are your core motivations? Why are you here? And I think one of the reasons that's important, it's okay, I'm here to serve others, but does that in some ways set you up to feel let down if that other can't be fixed? And is there a motivation that can just be closer to, my motivation is to care for others by bringing the most compassionate person I can to the room. And that in that way, it's not a direct self-care, but it's caring for yourself from the very foundation of what the expectations are you put onto you. And I think, especially for folks in the helping professions, there's a lot of really heartfelt aspiration towards compassion, and a lot of really sensitive, empathetic hearts. And it really bums me out how many people burn out in the profession quickly, because they just are, I care too much, it's too hard, I can't keep going, And I think that there's an interesting level of being able to be aware of the suffering of others as somewhat separate from the self. Not that they're distant or other, but what's happening to them is not actually happening to me. And it's a really fine line. So you have the empathic response, someone's suffering, and there may be this personal distress alongside it of what can I do, can I help? And unfortunately, especially if you're working in the schools or hospitals or the jails, there's so much systemically wrong. There's so many inadequacies. You can't help a lot of people. And so if your expectation, again, is I'm here to help people, and it's only that's the only thing that matters, that's the real setup, I think, to have a lot of heartbreak. And so one of the first things I do for self-care with ethics is, what do you need in order to kind of feel fulfilled? And what do you need from the world? And then how will that help you give back? So kind of just in a very methodical way, asking these questions of introspection, getting people clear on their motivation and getting people clear on the expectations they have for themselves. It's usually like a full day workshop, so I'm sorry if that's really dense, but it's an opening. Thanks. Yeah.
So I feel like having compassion for others is a lot more clear and straightforward than having compassion for myself. Like that seems like more like something I need to be taught, and I feel like a lot of people have that experience. Why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's a very good question. Did everybody hear that question? Why it's so much harder? There's a neat, and I'm sorry if any of you have heard the story, but it's kind of always interesting to hear it again. When the Dalai Lama was having one of these meetings with Western scientists and psychologists put on by the Mind and Life Foundation in 1990, there was a teacher there, a very well-known Dharma teacher, Sharon Salzberg, and he'd already had a day of people talking about this Western embrace of Buddhism, and it's brand new, and everyone's excited, and Sharon's describing, I'm doing these practices, and I'm doing these practices, and well, then I'm doing this self-compassion thing just because people hate themselves so much. And then there's a pause. And the Dalai Lama is actually speaking to Alan Wallace, who I mentioned before, a teacher of mine, who'll actually be teaching here next month. And Alan and the Dalai Lama are going back and forth, like 20 minutes of discussion. Dalai Lama then turns to his whole row of monks, back and forth. And he says, looks at all the Western scientists and says, "You guys really hate yourselves sometimes?" And they were like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Self-compassion," right? So I'm not blaming it on a Western culture, but it certainly wasn't traditional to at least the Tibetan adaptation of these practices. Self-compassion, it's not that it didn't exist, it just wasn't as needed. And I really think, again, if we go back to that key idea that one of our main sources of suffering is separateness, I think we're exceptional at making people feel separate in a Western materialist, consumeristic culture, And so I think that's part of why it's such a big struggle for us here. And the more and more we can feel, no matter what it is that we're suffering or struggling with, everyone in this room has experienced it, the easier that practice becomes for ourselves, right? And, again, in that taking the baby steps and going easy, I always try to imagine whatever my own struggle is that I'm bummed on myself about. Imagine it's happening to my really good friend. Start there, and then it's like that fake out, oh no! So that's a recommendation. But thanks for the question. Yeah. Yeah, please.
Can you talk a little bit about accountability when it comes to ethics? I was thinking of the gentleman who was talking about the people who are killing elephants.
Yeah.
And trying to have compassion for them.
Yeah.
So can you talk about how you marry compassion with accountability?
Yeah. So you're saying of others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or even yourself.
Yeah. I have a whole tangent on the self one, which is I weirdly, I love this idea of vigilance, which sounds terrible, who likes vigilance? That sounds like an awful thing. But being vigilant to your practice, to your speech, to your mind, it's such an awesome, bless you, such an awesome challenge, right? So it's yes, I have this ethic of not harming others. The minute you walk out that door, your speech, your mind, it's gonna, and so that kind of vigilance I really like, and that's an accountability to the self. But when we think about accountability to others, a little bit of this is just the reality testing of it. It's not that we don't hold people accountable, these people do horrific things. You don't let them off the hook by having compassion for them, but you do recognize that beneath those acts is an actor, and that actor is not bad. They're deluded. And so I think that's a little bit of a it's a fine line to walk, because I agree, you really want to, there are agreed upon ideals of how we should treat one another and how we should act, and yet there's also what can we do to have this peace of mind for ourselves. And it really, there's only one ingredient, and it's compassion. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah. think, yeah, one more question. Yeah, please.
I'm just curious of the whole thing about kindness and how it applies to basically like on two things. Like one, is there like biological signs or is there things you can tell when you're kind of bordering between kindness and enabling in terms of like, you know, working with addiction and stuff like that and that kind of, and then kind of a similar question, but it's more societal. When there's, you know, obvious injustices in our society and the world and stuff, like when does anger or when does kindness not suffice, or how do you transform kindness?
Great question. I don't know if people heard that, but like, is kindness sometimes harmful, right? Like if we're enabling people to harm themselves, and is anger sometimes just, especially in the face of injustice? Yes, yes. And there's actually this great teaching that I heard from this abbess in the Green Gulch Center up in Marin, so this Zen abbess, and she talks about the 999 arms of compassion, right, or kindness. Some of them offer you a flower, and some of them are like a blazing sword, right? So there's a lot of ways compassion is enacted, or kindness. It's not always just by being a fuzzy marshmallow. It is sometimes by setting those hardest boundaries, right?
So I'm just wondering, do you have any advice for how to wear whatever sword? Like, you can, you know, it's so easy when to say I'm showing you tough love, but are there like, just want to, are there physical symptoms that you can pay attention to? When
No, I like where you're going with that, but like the anger that we feel against injustice and the anger we feel in blaming someone, so probably in a way that's not helpful, has the exact same physiological signature. It looks the same, it feels the same, it's expressed the same way. It just is different in terms of its consequence. And so a lot of the ways in which we identify that, unfortunately, is in reflection. But if we have any ability to have some foresight, then we can hopefully enter or approach that with some reflection. Because there's no way biologically, but there's absolutely a way through insight of, you know, I think anyone who's done any clinical practice, you're like, when is the time I'm the shoulder and when is the time that I'm kind of the hard line? And sometimes it's through mistakes, but I think it's a really good question to keep asking. We have a little bit of time left, and what I'd really like to do is thank, first of all the folks here at ATS who are volunteers, who are making this happen tonight. It's really great. They are doing what many of you have heard, which is called, they're doing an act of dana, or kindness or generosity. They are donating their time to be here and enacting their ethics. And for those of you who've been at Dharma Talk, you always hear the dana pitch, which is exercise your generosity and donate to the center. And we would love and encourage that. And I do think that, one thing I would really invite us all to do is, tune into the kindness for the next couple days. Like, watch for it, look for it, see how it arises in yourself and others. I think it's a really powerful practice. And I'm hoping we could just sit for these last 2 minutes to dedicate our practice. So just taking a couple breaths to settle back into the body. Just to relax into our breath and let the ideas or feelings just simply slip away for the moment. And then shifting our mind to the space of our thoughts and ideas. We consider for a moment if there's been any benefit to us being together this evening, practicing, discussing. We consider the symbolic act of offering any merit and all of the goodness we've generated together, and we dedicate it. We dedicate it to all of those who aren't here, all of those who don't even know to be here. And to that outrageous ideal and hope that we could dedicate it to all sentient beings. And we dedicate it to those voices just outside the door. And we dedicate it to each and every one of us in this room, supporting each other's practice and just showing up. Thank you all very much. I hope you can come next week, bring your friends.